So welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. And in this week's episode, I'm joined by Alex Hoffmann, who leads investments into strategic business areas at the very interesting intersections between food and health on behalf of M Ventures, a global corporate venture fund. And I've got to know Alex well over the last few years. And Alex, great to have you on the show. Thanks for making the time. Looking forward to our chat.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So maybe just taking it back. I know, like you're a young man still, as it were, and
I feel like
not too much grey hair. But tell me, like, growing up, I'm just thinking about the kind of key influences on a young kind of Alex, as it were, growing up.
Yeah. Well, I think, growing up for me being half German, half Syrian, actually. So my mother is from Syria, and I was born in Syria, but then grew up for a while in Yemen and then in Germany. So it's I think that global and international thinking was probably something that I grew up with quite a bit. Having spoken French at home, so it's multiple languages and being in different countries is something that I think affected me throughout my life, so that it became for me also quite important to think globally, to think a bit beyond borders, but also collect that experience. And I think just from university then throughout my professional life, that has always been something that's important to me. So that's one part, and then the other is I like to call it creativity. So I'm a passionate piano player and love music and art. And I think that's at some point in my life, I was actually considering going for a creative career as well. I'm quite happy I didn't and kept it as a hobby, but I think it's still something that that keeps me, or like that kind of guides me also throughout professional life. And I like to think that also what we do, even if it's venture capital and a financial asset class, that after all it's still led by creativity, because I think everything that's future oriented and finding new ways to existing problems is also to some extent driven by creativity. So I think it comes down to finding who is most creative, but with the ability to turn this into a sustainable business as well. So yeah, that's still, I think, something that's part of my life, and I like to think it's guiding me in my professional career as well.
Absolutely. Tell me, when you had to make those decisions, why did you therefore not go down the creative way? And just clarify, it's piano playing, right? That you
Yes.
Okay.
Well, for one, I think I had parents who were scared. Number one. Two, I did send off applications. I had the opportunity to go to one uni in Germany, actually. This was for composing. Ultimately I decided against it just by speaking to people who either have gone down that path or who haven't. And I did realize that I also like some basic security in my life, and I think after some rational thinking, I wasn't sure this was really provided with a purely creative career. And I think also the acknowledgement that turning a hobby into a professional career is a big step. So being dependent on something that you like to do in terms of for pleasure, after long thoughts and many discussions, I decided that it's probably safer to combine, let's say, a more a safer education like business administration, and that would still not preclude you to do something creative. So again, looking back, to me, I think it was a good decision not to, or like to try to combine two worlds in a certain way.
Absolutely. No, that's great. Really interesting perspective. But then I suppose as you then embark on your career, clearly you're looking for something which is going to allow you to kind of nurture that creativity as well. So how did you see that earlier in your career, prior to the, the ventures stuff that you do now, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was, I think the most obvious one was in marketing. So I did start, most of my earlier jobs were in marketing. I specialized in marketing for my master's degree. So my initial pathway was actually, a very traditional one, to go through the big brand houses like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and the likes. I'm again here happy that I, through again discussions, networking, speaking to people, identified the startup world as probably more interesting and more exciting way to not only learn but also take responsibility earlier on. So again, through marketing, which in my view is one of the creative or more creative departments in any organization, to then find my way into venture-backed startups that are trying to revolutionize something that hasn't happened before, or disrupt something that may need disruption, may need change. So I think in a way it's always a good combination, I find, of something new, and trying to drive this by innovative creativity, if you will.
Absolutely. No, I can see that. And so what got you, I mean, so how long have you been on the M Ventures, on the venturing side, and maybe just outline a little bit about the kind of group that you're responsible for, lead, as it were.
So I've started there 4.5 years ago. And I mean, it was not a very linear pathway to get there, I must say. But I think I've been drawn into venture capital since basically having started in venture-backed companies. So the link to VCs has been there before. So understanding what VCs, or at least the investors you have backing your company, are expecting. So there was something that I at least understood very, very early on. I was to some extent fascinated by it, to just try to look at companies from a big picture perspective. So something that I did find interesting, and then through some different routes, I ended up at M Ventures, which is the corporate venture fund of Merck. So I did have one step in my career at Merck, which was being responsible for the digital strategy for the African continent. And so this is where I spent a couple of years also in Kenya to then lead that strategy and implement it on the ground. So very entrepreneurial, bit more, big picture type of responsibility to say, how can we leverage digital tools for a company like Merck in a continent like Africa? So it was a pretty interesting task. And then from there, I think it was primarily also driven by my push also towards Merck to say we should think about how digital also impacts a company like Merck and the healthcare ecosystem, which got me in touch with back then the managing director of our corporate venture fund at that time, called MS Ventures, and purely focused on biotech investments, so therapeutics. And then in 2016, when my time in Kenya actually, reached an end anyway, I got this opportunity to then also join M Ventures and start building out what we today call the Frontier Tech and Sustainability Fund, which is part of the 400 million euro overall fund of M Ventures. And so the mandate that I got together with a colleague at the time was that we should, first of all, think about how else can we future-proof a company like Merck? What technologies are developing outside of Merck that Merck doesn't understand, but that will have an impact on the future businesses of Merck? And this was primarily things like, digital, AI, on healthcare. How will it impact how pharma companies do R&D? How will it impact how patients are being diagnosed, so patients are being treated? So we made a couple of investments in that space, And early on, we always had in mind that we also wanted to think about what more a company like Merck has to offer. And I think if you look at that company, there are so many different technologies available, but also markets that it operates in, from ranging from healthcare to semiconductors. So it's a pretty broad spectrum. And so we also started to think about how does biotechnology and synthetic biology, which are technologies that Merck understands very well, can be transferred into new areas, and at the same time also have a potentially positive impact. And so this is how we got to alternative protein, looked into that space quite a bit, and then expanded that mandate to say, okay, let's look into food, let's look into biomaterials and the likes, and therefore led to other investments in companies like Mosamid and Legendary. So yeah, that's essentially what we do. We invest early on, primarily at Series A stages. We like to invest when companies are still in a technology validation phase, because we like to take some of that technology risk on us and to de-risk it further with the capital that we bring in, but also with the expertise that we and our parent company can bring in. And yeah, so that's more or less what we're doing. Great.
No, thank you for that. And when you say about you de-risk some of the technology, you take some of that technology risk, how did Merck get involved in the early stage to help you de-risk that type of thing? I'm always curious to know how corporate work with some of the smaller companies.
That's a very good question, I think, and we get that a lot, given that we are a corporate venture fund. So it's I think usually two types of questions. One is, how strategic do we invest, and then what value add can we bring? And I think on the strategic side of things, so we are a strategic investor, which in our view means that we want to invest in topics that benefits both the portfolio company and Merck alike. And with that, we don't mean any option rights or any clauses in the investment agreements. It's purely a financial investment from that perspective. But we want to have that alignment with our parent company to say, we believe a technology like, again, clean meat, to use that example, is strategic to a company like Merck, because if that succeeds, if it really becomes a market, then a company like Merck could potentially supply into that industry that today doesn't exist, but hopefully in a couple of years will be a larger market, and therefore an opportunity to a company like Merck. So that's how we think strategically. But with having said this, there's no specific rights, no exclusivity. So we like to bring that value add, which is the second point, differently by just being a good investor, trying to really deliver value where and when it's needed. And we try to do that by introducing companies to people within Merck who could help, especially in different phases of the company. Like, again, using Mosamid as an example, at phases where you need to identify serum-free medium for optimal cell growth, for example. This is something that Merck understands well. So just having the opportunity to speak with people who are experts in cell culture media is something that at least we can offer. If the company wants to access it, they can. But it's a separate discussion to be had between the portfolio company and Merck. But we are there to basically create those links, or in later stages when it gets to companies who are interested in potential commercial collaboration. So this is again where we can leverage at least the connection that we have to Merck, and where Merck also understands that we're trying to make those links. So it's I think beneficial in most of the cases for both, but also not something that we pre-agree. It's really something that we try to then initiate once we are already invested, and once the company reaches those milestones or those steps in their company progress that perhaps also needs the right support. So yeah, it's always case by case, I'd say.
Yeah, no, got it. So I think with Mosamid, right, is because you guys, as you said, very experienced around some of that kind of that cell culture media, right? And the nature of the business is quite similar in terms of the manufacturing component and the, in terms of the way that business runs. I was always trying to find that link between most of me when I looked at the investment portfolios. Most of me and Merck, I was like trying to work it out, but it's the nature of developing kind of cells, right, and growing cells through fermentation.
Exactly. Yeah. So if we think of basically anything that's upstream, from cell culture media to I don't know, scaffolding solutions to bioreactors, these are topics that Merck understands quite well already for the pharmaceutical industry. So obviously it's a transfer. There's a transfer required in terms of, what does pharma need and what does food need? And obviously the requirements already in production in regulatory requirements are completely different. But that transfer is more likely to happen than from a traditional food manufacturer, right? Who don't operate in bioreactors or in cells, essentially, or with cells. So that, I think this was the kind of intersection that we thought was very interesting. At the same time, looking at the meat market, it's not something that Merck is active in today, like far away from it actually. But having said this, it's an immense market, and at the same time, if you take everything into consideration that is linked to meat production today, it just ticked so many boxes and opened so many eyes, that it very quickly also became one of the favorite topics at Merck to really speak about. So our investment at the time has triggered basically the corporate to start like an innovation field and a dedicated group that really works now with startups in that field, to say Merck as a company is really trying to contribute to not only to that up and coming industry, but also to trying to solve some of the most pressing challenges of the world. So I think it was a very good signal and a very good example of how sometimes early stage investments can help really move many things in a very large corporate as well, which is interesting.
Right. Very interesting, actually. It's great to see. It's a really good story, and that market is just, it's exploded. If we were having a chat, when did you make your investment? What year was it?
2018.
2018. Even the last 3 years or so, it's just, I think, incredible growth. I think we read a figure. It was like, I think last year was the $3 billion kind of investment. Yeah. The alternative protein space, which is just it's incredible, isn't it, really? I don't know, looking at it now, it just looks so obvious, and maybe it didn't look so obvious 10 years ago or so, but
no, even 2018, I remember when we and there were 5 companies at the time, so we spoke to actually all of them, and it wasn't that easy to find co-investors. Because it was, as we said, at this intersection of food, like a consumer product, and biotech. So you had, the typical biotech investors. To them, it was a bit too far off because they typically looked at more pharma, life science topics. And then you had the tech investors who said, well, we don't understand anything. We can't judge whether that technology actually works. And so, we were left in the middle. I think by now the landscape has completely changed. You have so many more investors who either have moved into that space or who are dedicated investors in alternative proteins. So it's really interesting to see that development.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Do you think with that, and I notice it as well in terms of new funds and even, you might get deep tech or pharma funds that want to, biotech funds that want to put a proportion of their funds into the intersection. But do you feel that with all the new capital kind of options and funds really specializing in this space, it's going to give companies more options, not just at the A stage, but it's probably the stage afterwards, the stage for scale up and growth? That's always been the kind of challenge and the difficulties when it comes to accessing larger pools, as it were.
No, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We have experiences with Most of me. So first of all, I'd say, you know, early stages, currently you have, to date, many investors who are willing to take that early risk. When it comes to later stages, or at least again in this valley of you had the early stage financing, but you still need to get to that, let's say, proof point of yes, we can go commercial. That's not easy in Europe. I would say you have it feels like it needs to catch up there as well, where you have the growth investors, because the capital is there. Actually, it's just invested in other topics. And I think it just needs to get to that stage where, again, more technology is validated, companies can prove that they can produce such products at larger scale at a cost point that is economically viable. And then I suppose the money will follow. But for anyone who's kind of the first in that space, that, in my view, is still difficult today in the European context. It's because there's still large risk involved, right? If you can't get the cost down, you simply have major risks of market introduction. But I mean, I'm happy that most of it was able to find the required capital to do so, but it's not easy. I would say it's. I hope that we'll see the same development as we've seen for early stage. That this will also follow basically for a bit later stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's it's good to see, like it's good to see ecosystems, you know, building up across Europe, like that surely really helps, right? I mean, really, if I think across Holland and Switzerland and Germany and France, it's now the modern kind of ecosystem and accelerator, and all of a sudden, it doesn't seem like we're short of brilliant ideas and entrepreneurs that have a great amount of kind of creativity. And I wonder if you've really seen that landscape change over the last few years.
Well, changed, I think, to the extent that, let me start differently. I think from a scientific point of view, European universities were, I think, always very good at least, creating world-class science. It was always that the missing link was basically turning that science into some sort of commercial entity, into commercial activities. Where other countries, especially the US or Israel also for that matter, are, way better. Like, students are being basically taught to think about their inventions more commercially. There are tech transfer offices who are way more active. They have university funds to actually fund such activities a bit more. So it's not that the science was lacking, it was more, that last step to get there. And I think this is changing now, where we see more university spin-outs happening. And I think also the bit of a change where, let's say, some of those, again, like real breakthroughs are still to be, or still happen in Europe, which is great to see. Again, if I think of, sorry for always the same example, but clean meat, I think, is one which has happened in the Netherlands. I think it's a very good example of how that has been taken forward. But we see this across many different spaces where you have. I think this is progressing quite a bit in Europe, and to a good degree. There can always be more and more capital, but I think that early stage risk is more understood now, and I feel that it's growing overall. So I'm hopeful that it will catch up somehow.
Yeah, no, it's a really evolving ecosystem. So I remember going out a few years ago to San Francisco and going to IndieBio, and I always remember that experience of coming out of there. It's the first time I'd ever seen it, really. Something as energetic, and it was just very the innovation that was happening there, for instance, and it just seemed like such a smart idea, basically, and we've seen a number of those pop up over in Europe, for instance, which have it must really help with deal flow, right? If you're investing early, I'm just picturing like, half the challenge is finding opportunities, and you go to an accelerator and you go around the world. If I was looking for deal flow, you go to all the accelerators, and then you've got all your deal flow there, basically. It seems like, it seems brilliant, basically. It seems a great flow, as it were.
No, it is. And I think also, I mean, especially in the UK, you have pretty good ones by now, like, SOSV with its Rebel Bio program, Entrepreneurs First. So there are, I'd say, some really good good accelerators that have emerged also in Europe. I mean, IndieBio is of course one, and given that we invest globally, it's also good for us. But yeah, absolutely, it's usually a very good source for deal flow, especially because those accelerators typically also help the companies to get investor ready, which universities don't always do, or not to the necessary level. So it's more work.
Yeah. Is that the gap then? Is that the gap, from university to being investable? They need that kind of, that accelerator can kind of help mentor, shape, and bring them to the point where they're going to be a viable investment opportunity, essentially.
I think so too. Yes. I mean, you have a few, I would say, professional tech transfer offices. I know, for example, here in the Netherlands, there is Brightlands, which is across multiple universities, and they have this a traditional tech transfer office. They have an associated fund with it, and I'd say they really go in very early, help the companies or help the founders basically to form a company, to find good agreements around licensing, because it's also always the question, where does the IP sit? Is it university, and what type of deals are basically the most investor friendly as well? So it is happening, but I'd say that that's still a gap that we observe depending on the university. So I'd say if that would be professionalized a little bit more, and those very early stage opportunities would be brought to a level where early stage investors are interested and also don't see the need to really put in all the necessary work to get it to the investable level, I think that would be massive help and boost to this ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working with Menno van Dijk at Scale Up Nation, actually, in Holland, and it's quite good to see, even services, I think, from that viewpoint, where organizations really are looking for that jump, as it were, from interesting technology to commercial products.
Yeah.
Really, it's such a big jump to make, and it's
absolutely
a support structure kind of coming in around that.
Yeah. I mean, you have that in Germany, as for example, this Fraunhofer Institute, and they do that as well, to take basically, or they have their own research, so it's not always linked to a university, but it can be, and they then take it also to get it to that next level. But it's so it exists, but I think comparing this to, for example, again, I think also UK is doing better, but especially US, Israel, there's still a large gap.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about the ecosystem and you think about the investment into early stage innovation, for instance, and you look across Europe, could you rate them at all in terms of where you see most progress, for instance? I'm just interested in how you would not prioritize, but how would you see how they're investing and moving together, whether it be from government or policy, into creating and continuing to grow in this space?
You mean rating in terms of like countries, or?
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, for instance, Germany. I haven't seen or done much stuff in Germany. I see quite a lot of stuff in Holland. I see quite a lot of stuff in France. Are Germany behind the curve?
That's a good question. It's well, I'm German. I'm usually more critical with my home country. I'd to some extent, perhaps yes. And again, I think that's probably linked, in my view, to some sort of risk averseness, and usually preferring to see problems rather than solutions. I mean, again, it depends on which particular ecosystem you're looking at. I think there are, very good groups, very good investors that I interact with regularly. I think it depends on the field. So if we look at the, traditional tech landscape and anything that's consumer tech, marketplaces, etc., that has been very successful in Germany. Companies like Rocket Internet, like Zalando, anything e-commerce, marketplaces, because that's very process driven. It's not necessarily the idea or let's say the IP behind, it's more execution. So I think that has worked very well. When it comes to things that again tend to be more risky, are IP heavy, and need longer development timelines, except for traditional biotech, I think Germany is lagging a bit behind. I mean, there are few examples. Just recently, one cell-based seafood company that received financing, Blue Biosciences. I don't know if you heard of them, but that's again a positive example, and it's I believe many German investors as well. So that's, I think, a good sign. But it's it's also not the first, which not aiming to discredit anyone here, but it's I think it's a good representation of where probably Germany is. That's one thing. In terms of, I think, just a pure infrastructure point of view, Germany is, I think, also very like administrative. It has high administrative burden, like to close a deal. Things like even ESOP, how you incentivize your teams. That's still very much in discussion. There's no clarity on how to find good ways on or to do that. So it's progressing, but very slowly. I have a bit more visibility in the Netherlands, where at least I mean things like risk averseness is definitely not the same. There's a higher appetite for risk, but there's also more capital available, perhaps, given that the Netherlands also has a favorable structure for venture funds to be here. So yeah, it's hard to say, and I think
that's great insight. It's really good insight. And also, obviously, in Holland we have the broader food and ag ecosystem. I mean, I visited the Wageningen a few years ago for the first time. I was blown away with that whole campus, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah, this would have been my third point, to say universities and what role they play, because I feel that especially the UK is very strong, with Cambridge, Oxford, and the likes that are, I think, also, first of all, known for its own science, and then also I think the fact that in Cambridge, as one example, you have a number of actually venture funds there to specialized to spin out technologies from the university. Wageningen in the Netherlands, I think, is a good example because it's highly specialized in food, and this has brought out also many companies and entrepreneurs in that space. It's harder in Germany to really pinpoint to one university. I think maybe Munich, the Technical University of Munich, has done a good job. They have many programs there that help basically turning science into commercial applications. But otherwise, it's a bit harder. I mean, there are fewer smaller ones, but it's not like you don't have like those very strong centers of excellence, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's
at least in my perception. Maybe the data is there and I don't know it, but yeah.
No, it's great to hear that perspective. And what about France? Do you get involved with any of the French companies at all in that ecosystem?
So far, not so much. We have, I think, two French companies in our portfolio. The only thing I know is if you don't speak French, it's a bit of a nightmare, because I think also there the administrative burden sometimes is high. So even things like, basically all the transaction documents have to be in French and they have to be read out in French, etc. So I think it's from that perspective perhaps also a bit similar to Germany, where it's not moving perhaps fast enough, but I don't have really good insights there. So it's just what I hear from colleagues who are involved in those companies.
No, absolutely. And no, it's great. Really good to get your sense and sense on that. I think it would be really useful. It would be good to just get a sense of, when you're about to deploy capital, for instance, let's see, you have your investments in your portfolio. I'm really interested to see the work that goes in before you actually make that investment. And I'm just really curious to know, what does that look like? How many companies do you need to vet before you deploy the capital? And, maybe we'll go there first rather than ask you 5 questions together. Please.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. So I'd say, usually 2 approaches. One, the one we prefer, which is a more bottom-up approach. So we identify field, we do our initial work to say, why do we think alternative protein is a good space? And so this is what we did in 2017 to really do a deep dive into alternative protein. I mean, we started early in the process to say, why even alternative protein? And then from there, really looked at the broader space from different types of alternative protein technologies, plant-based, algae-based, insect-based, and so on. And then cell-based, and then try to really look at what technologies are required for each, try to understand where we see the biggest overlap with our parent company, where Merck could help the most, or really could unlock basically the future success of such companies or a field. And from there, try to see how advanced is that field, how many companies are there. If it's too advanced, and we've seen already more than 20 companies and hundreds of millions already invested in that space, then perhaps it's too late. And if that's not the case, and again using the clean meat example, but I think that this just was a good one because it was so new to many people also within our company. There were 5 companies. There was a little bit of funding. There was some scientific evidence that it could work. So it was early enough, but let's say proof of concept was there to say it can be done. It's just a question, can it be scaled up? So for us in the thesis, why a certain company, I think, so many different considerations, and it depends on the risk level of that specific company. If the risk is higher, then we tend to prefer companies that are a bit closer to home, like geographically, so that we can, just be physically available if needed. We pay obviously quite a big portion of attention to the technology, to the IP. Is that, can you protect it? Is it, good enough in the sense, do we believe based on our own assumptions that this, the models make sense?
You have an IP team that would look at that, for instance. And is that part of the Merck team, or is that part of your ventures group, for instance?
So we can leverage the Merck team for that. So we have a patents group at Merck that support us with that. So and it covers basically anything from freedom to operate to really how protectable is the filed IP. So that's, I think, very useful. You can obviously also outsource that to specialized law firms. So we have, I'd say, the benefit of having that in-house, which is useful. And I'd say a big portion, of course, is attributed to the team. How much confidence do we have in the team to bring something forward? At the same time, I think we also sometimes recognize that maybe initial teams, especially if it's early on, are maybe too scientific and may need some additions in the management team as well over time. And again, depending on the profile of the management team, sometimes we bring this up immediately prior to investing, and we see how open they are to say perhaps you'd need someone who can come in at a later stage to lead the company as a CEO. Most of the times, the companies are okay with that because their core expertise is more in the science or in the production or in other fields, and not necessarily with the experience of having led a company from very early stages to commercial success. So and that's a very difficult bridge to make anyway.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
yeah,
no, that's
so
great.
that's I mean, again, it's like I'd say the very typical things that any any VC would look at. But I think in our case, we're very much technology focused. So really trying to understand the very details of the technology, how likely that is to materialize, and try to consult as much as possible with also the groups that we have within Merck. Given that, me personally, I don't have the scientific background, but it's, I think, of importance to just understand what questions need to be asked and where you can find the answers. And if you can get to that, I think it's you can get to a conclusion, at least, whether you think it's the reward outweighs the risk at some point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So tell me then, you've got the balance, like final question, I'm just thinking about the balance. You've got the technology, as you said, a real component, and you've got the team, for instance. And clearly both have to be aligned for you to invest, as it were. But from a team perspective, what are the things that you've generally, when you've, for instance, not invested because of the team, what have been the things that have been lacking, for instance?
That's a very good question. It's well, I mean, first of all, I think it's an overall package. You try to see, do you get along? Do you feel like you can speak eye to eye? Is it based on also some sort of trust, like mutual trust? At the same time, I think the trust comes with how the process has been from diligence to a potential close. Is it? Do you feel like there's sufficient also mutual belief in each other to say we can support each other, because ultimately I think everyone needs to work together to get to a concrete result. So what has led in some cases, I'd say, again, if that chemistry doesn't work out properly, if it comes down sometimes also to being, again, honest and transparent to say, what is it that you don't know? And it's fine, right? I mean, I don't expect, especially at early stages, from a founder or management team to know everything. But I think it's good. To me, it's very helpful to know if a management team understands what it is that they don't know yet, right, and how to get basically to an answer and what is needed to get there. So it's showing that weakness, if you will, is in my view extremely beneficial, because it's not about claiming that you know everything. It's more about being capable of knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. So I think that's important. It's helpful if teams are well prepared, in the sense that they have everything they need, everything the investors need. The data room, in my view, is helpful. It doesn't have to be a data room per se, but at least being ready to have documents available that investors ask for, and being also willing to basically share insights that the investors would want to know. So yeah, but again, I think it's, and this is most of the times also driven by some sort of chemistry. Really, do you want to work together? Do you feel like this could be a 5+ year relationship that you need to embark on together? Because it's
like a marriage. It's like a marriage.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. It's a longer term thing, and I think everyone should feel very comfortable in collaborating, because otherwise it won't be an easy one. And again, that's why I think this trust and transparency is super important on both sides, right? So same from our side, we try to always ask, what type of investor do you look for? Are we the ones that you want? And also be transparent on how our processes look like, what we need, what timelines they can expect. And, if every box is ticked, then I think we're happy to then take the next steps. Great
stuff. And Alex, it's thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been, as it always is with you, it's always been a privilege and pleasure to speak. So thanks for sparing the time and coming on today.
Thank you so much, Simon. Same here. Really pleasure. And thanks for asking. And yeah, very happy to be here.